before I get started, the Wi-Fi password, I just put it up, is welcome1. And I'll warn you ahead of time that I was pretty liberal with quoting and including paragraphs in my presentation. I'm not going to be reading them to you. You can read them later. But what I've done is I've made a PDF available at tinyurl.com, Buckman under, and it does work with Android and iPhone phones as well as computers. So if you want to follow up and not squint, that's one way to go about it. My email address is at the top, and please follow up with me if you want to follow up in any way. Good. So, actually, just one question, which is, when am I supposed to wrap this up? Noon? Is that right?
3/4 now.
All right. 12:15, 12:10. All right. And I'll leave some time in case there are any questions. So the structure of my talk is Britain under the thumb of, and I'll be talking about under the thumb of itself, big business, that sort of thing, as well as the EU and the States. And then I'll also be making some comparisons about how the EFF works and how org works and how the governments and the cultures are different and how different approaches yield different results. Now, I live half the year in London and half in the States, so that makes me sort of aware of both, not a master of either. There are absolute policy wonks on the org board and advisory board. Some of them are here. If you want to go deep on some of this stuff, that's who to talk to. So under the thumb of itself was my first topic, and really copyright is probably the biggest menace to the internet right now, both in the States and in the UK. But one of the things that popped up recently was this idea of the Royal Charter, which is a scheme that the UK government proposed to have the press regulate itself. And the really scary thing about this, it sounds kind of good, is that there are clauses specifically in it to include blogs, comments to blogs, anybody who is doing any reporting on news. And this was also interesting, a person who's in the UK is defined as someone who's in the UK, or they can be elsewhere in the world if they're reporting primarily about the UK, which is an interesting jurisdictional concept. So these Royal Charter would apply even if you weren't in the UK. The Royal Charter, let me move that so. There we go. It's always great in these things to quote Cory Doctorow. You can read it later. But he essentially summarizes the menace to bloggers and tweeters. One of the funny things about the Digital Economy Act, which is a new law that's also been passed, ostensibly to push the 3 strikes law, is that the copyright industry has been saying this is going to reduce copyright theft by 70%. And this thing was rushed through, but it still hasn't been enacted. But what's really cute is most recently the government asked the copyright industry to pay for it, and suddenly they went, oh, pay for it? Well, and the government said, well, if it's going to reduce piracy by 70%, then it's a fantastic investment, don't you think? Well, the trouble is that the copyright industry has some experience with trying to block piracy, and with not much success. It appears that no one at BPI knows how to use Google, because I don't know about you, but most people don't actually type thepiratebay.se. In fact, I don't even know it's in Sweden. You go to Google, you type Pirate Bay in, and what happens? 1, 2, 3 hits up. The first 3 hits are all live links to the Pirate Bay that Google will happily give you. Now, what I don't understand about this is that the ruling that came down by the court to block the Pirate Bay says to block the Pirate Bay domain and any domain that points to the Pirate Bay. And BPI is supposed to give an updated list on a regular basis to the ISPs so that they do this. But apparently BPI, after doing all this lobbying and getting the court to do this, can't actually be asked to have a 14-year-old intern search once a week on Google and give them Pirate Bay proxy list. That seems like an obvious domain to think about. Proxy Bay info. I don't actually know what's going on. It doesn't make sense. The only thing I can think of is that BPI are not stupid. They know this is utterly futile, but they like to keep their jobs. So what they are told is to do something, even if it's futile. Go into court, make a bit of fuss, get in the press, block the Pirate Bay for a day, is what it took. It was blocked for a day. But since no one actually knows it's in Sweden, they just go to Google and I feel lucky, and they go right to it. So, and if you know about the Barbra Streisand effect, it's pointing to something that's hidden, causing a big fuss. And in fact, that's what happened. Now everyone in the UK knows about the Pirate Bay. They had a huge, in fact, more hits ever, thanks to the block. So it's an odd thing that you have this. But the reason I wanted to mention the block is because for the first time ever now in the UK, we've got a system where the court can just tell ISPs, block this website. And I don't want to talk about the US for a second because the US has lots of scary stuff and it seems far away and the government's quite different. But Australia, 3 days ago, blocked 1,200 websites. And 1,200 websites that were not associated with anything that anyone can figure out being bad. In fact, one was a free university. And the only response that came back when people inquired why am I blocked is on order of the government. There was no appeals process, nothing. This was 3 days ago. And we don't even know what 1,200 sites were blocked, only that some of them ought not to have been. And then 3 days later, it was removed. So this is a government fairly similar to the UK government, certainly out of the same legal tradition, putting a blocking system in, and then just kind of arbitrarily blocking stuff with no approval, no review process, not even a list of what is blocked. That's not a direction we definitely want to go to. So, won't somebody think of the children is sort of the British version of terrorism. It's used to pass all sorts of wonderful things. My own little personal annoyance, and you've probably all experienced it, is mobile phone censorship. Since we don't know who could have your phone, it could be a child, we should block sites that mention virtually anything that might be upsetting to a parent. The trouble is, last I checked, kids usually have computers. And none of this exists on computers either. For some reason, mobile phones, it's okay. Just as open access, for example, applies to computers, but not mobile phones. But there's also a broader question here. Besides being annoying to adults, there's no appeals process, things just get banned. We're going more and more to a mobile, always-on world where stuff is just banned arbitrarily. The second issue is how are kids even supposed to be educated when they're in this sort of nanny bubble? And they can't actually get information. They search the word breast and they go to a website about breasts. Be they male or female kids, it'll be blocked on their phone. And that's an odd way to think, an odd society that we're building. Okay, so much for the UK. How about under the thumb of the EU? These cartoons were slightly modified by me. You won't find them exactly, but this is kind of the feeling a lot of us in the UK have, is the EU is out there making policies and doesn't really care what the UK has to say. They're not elected in the same way. We don't feel represented. My feeling is actually, as an American, that the EU is largely actually a positive force for privacy and internet rights. One of the reasons is the bureaucrats there, much like the bureaucrats in the UK, there are a lot of actually decent people there who want to know what civil society should do, what democratic society should worry about. They think longer term. And so there are things, for example, like the EU right to privacy. You know, this doesn't exist in the UK, or it didn't before, it does now. And it's been used in a number of times to kill things that look like creeping privacy invasions. Facebook has run afoul of it, so has Google. Yes? Yes. Okay. Fair enough. I still think of it as Europe affecting the UK. But this has been used, and the data protection regulation, which in the States we largely don't have anything like it. California has something where they're trying to pass a law saying you should be able to find out who has information on you, but that's all. The whole idea that there's data protection, that you should have a right to private life, that you should have the right to actually have the information erased. These are some of the topics being covered on the new regulation, and there are some good things in it. So overall, I see that as a positive force. I also highlighted this Privacy Campaign EU, which is a cross-organization website. You'll see org there, as well as EDRI, Julia Group in Sweden, working on this sort of thing. And it makes me quite happy, especially when we talk about how bad the government is in the US, to see some talk about things that are good. Now, the US, again, the copyright industry, the fat cats. The biggest, most recent big threat has been treaties. And the idea behind treaties is to avoid democratic review. The original DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which made it illegal in the States to circumvent copy protection, was actually not passed through democratic process in the US. It was very unpopular, and it wasn't going to pass. And what happened is they went to white vote, the US went to white vote, passed it in a treaty, and then forced the US to adopt it as a law. Now that's how DMCA got passed in the States. And the same approach was then tried with ACTA, and was getting stuff through. And maybe all of you know this, but essentially a trade treaty doesn't have to be voted in those places, in those countries, to get passed into law, or it's forced, their hand is forced. But there were lots of protests about ACTA, and finally the EU got a spine, or certain governments got a spine, and it died. But now we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is kind of SOPA reborn. It just seems like these things come through. That doesn't seem to be having much headway in Europe, but Japan, for whatever reason, seems quite keen on it. I think whoever is looking for money from the States suddenly becomes quite keen to support these things. And then we're stuck with them. Another quote that you can see in the PDF about the similarities. And in the States, terrorism has been a really big issue, a big way for the government to just creep into all sorts of things. But there's been a fantastic counter-push, which really has been led by Google. If you don't know about the Google Transparency Report, this started a few years ago, giving statistics about how many requests for identity they were being asked for, how many suppression of websites they're being asked for. It's now expanded massively into a quite useful website. I just happened to put up the page on Google about Facebook, and I don't know if you can see, but it's kind of interesting. 776 requests for takedowns from Microsoft about Facebook on Google. And you can actually click down and it'll show you more about this. Basically, the pressure from Google came from the shift when Google decided to pull out of China, and there was a culture shift inside that organization. And they used this to show that the US actually in many ways was as bad as China in censorship, suppression, using military excuses to do what they want. It hasn't caused the government to change much, but it's definitely caused much more awareness. Thanks to Google, actually, of all people, Twitter is a new ally and has been working with EFF to try and craft a privacy policy, a legal agreement with its users that will actually protect privacy, meaning if you Twitter and then you remove a tweet, the government can't get it. And if you Twitter anonymously, they can't figure out who you are. And thus far, it's really depressing. The best lawyers at Twitter and EFF have not been able to craft a privacy policy that the government doesn't find a way around. So the current state of things is because Twitter can retweet things, the government considers it to be completely accessible permanently. So as long as Twitter has the right to retweet things, you have no right to privacy on Twitter. Twitter also fought until the bitter end to not reveal the deleted tweets and the identity of people associated with WikiLeaks who were posting on Twitter. and lost, and they decided to stop fighting because the sanctions were going to mount into, well, they were asking for their gross revenue numbers to see just how many tens of millions it should be. So Twitter eventually folded, but is really pushing hard to be in the same sort of Google position of fighting for its users. Microsoft, never to be outdone on the PR front, has decided to try and be transparent, but it seems like they're only transparent when numbers look good. So they talk about some of the things, interestingly enough, the most interesting thing about the transparency report from Microsoft is that they don't talk about Skype. And they own Skype now, and there's real questions about Skype being used for widespread wiretapping. And there's no information about that. And that's a concern. But what's lovely is they put out the transparency report, and then they get a lot of shit about not having this, which then starts an internal dialogue, one hopes, pushing for further transparency. The Facebook privacy controls. Now, the reason this is interesting is that there's probably no greater privacy nightmare today than Facebook. First of all, it's in the US, in a government climate that allows most any government worker to bypass Facebook security controls. If you Google, there are many, many examples of people, for example, applying for a job at the post office and people's private Facebook policies pages being up during the interview, despite them being hidden. So for things that are not associated with security at all, government workers can simply bypass Facebook security to see what's going on. Now, in the hands of an incompetent person, usually the government, a big database is not as scary. Unfortunately, Facebook is very competent. And I'll be talking in a second about the Facebook social graph feature, which is an incredibly clever search engine. And this quote from Mark Zuckerberg is a bit terrifying. And there are many like that. EFF has charted, and there's many other charts showing how Facebook really wants to just get rid of privacy. And this is over each year, what was private, you can see who could see it. All of Facebook and the entire internet couldn't see much. But now, everything you do as of 2010 is visible to everybody on Facebook. Again, that might not be so scary if it were hard to use. But the Facebook graph search, these are real questions. You can Google Facebook graph search and type them in, and you will get the names of people who match these searches. My favorite one is current employees of Tesco who like horses. But sometimes it also leads to really interesting things. Current employers of people who like racism. And so who are the top companies in the States with racist employees? Target and McDonald's, besides the military. Now, I purposely picked something that we can also laugh at, but you can run with this in any way. People indicate what kind of people they are. There's an interesting academic study tying specifically IQ to the sort of things that you like or dislike. So if you like Harley-Davidson, for example, your IQ points are 10 points lower on average. And so you can use Facebook to actually get a pretty good portrait of somebody in terms of what they're not saying. So if they like these 10 things, they probably like these 2 other things that you're not seeing statistically. So that's all the scary bad news stuff. I don't like to talk all about that, only because org and EFF have both been quite successful, and other organizations as well. And so I want to talk about some of the good news, some of the things we've seen. You should know, if you aren't org members, supporting org and supporting EFF has changed the world and will continue to. Close to home here, since I live half the year in the UK, I'm on the EFF board, I've always pushed EFF to think about international issues. And there's a really strong department there now. So recently, we brought back Danny O'Brien, who's co-founder of Open Rights Group, and he is the head of the international group at EFF in San Francisco. We've doubled the staff to 6 people, and I know we're hiring more still. That's pretty interesting. So we're much more active on the international front than we have been before. EDRI is a tremendously important organization of organizations, of which Open Rights Group is. So anything happening on the EU front that is EFF org like EDRI is actually the right organization to be working through. URL there, and you can see a bunch of organizations across Europe. EFF is also involved. And just mentioning aside, Article 19, London-based organization about free speech, also really interesting, worth supporting. A few years ago, actually in 2005, the Gowers Review was being made, and one of the things that was interesting is they contacted org to participate in the process and to opine. And opine we did, and Gowers came out with some really wonderful things that were ignored. Later on, Hargrave's review on copyright extensions was commissioned, and he came out with 10 recommendations. To my knowledge, only 2 are now going into law, but 2 is something. It's certainly not the direction we're used to. Both quite important. I remember the BPI saying, yes, it is illegal to rip a CD in the UK, but we don't plan on prosecuting. So don't change the law, because we're not going to enforce it. That's not a great situation. It's not good for respect for the law, and it's not good to have laws that are silly, that shouldn't be there. Private copying will now be allowed, private backup, and parody. That's good news. I'll just say in passing, though, parody has been incredibly hard in the courts to sustain, because if you do satirize or parody something, someone brings a suit against you, it's usually better to just fold, because it's too expensive to defend. Without fines for lawsuits that should never have been brought, the parody right, at least in the States, has not been worth much. However, what if org had lawyers? And this is good news, I thought, was org has talked about having a lawyer on staff, and there was a drive. And we got halfway. So 150 members joined, and org now has a part-time legal assistant, is that right?
Hiring.
Hiring, okay.
Well, the plan is to get enough money to hire someone full-time. So we've got a couple of grant applications. Once we've got that, we'll hire.
I don't know if you could hear that. The plan is to go full-time, not part-time, which is great, because my slide was actually, we're only 150 people away from hiring a full-time person. The reason this is important is that most of the... Does that still work? Nope. Same channel. Okay. Most of the field that org plays in is the field of laws and government. And org was founded by, well, originally the original head of org was Sue Charman, who came as an ex-journalist, and the next person also was a journalist, and there's always been this tradition inside org of providing clear information, factual, and never bullshitting. And that has built a reputation which is highly respected, which is one of the reasons bureaucrats and civil servants come to org and ask for their opinion. At the same time, org does not speak the language of law. It doesn't have lawyers on staff to play that game. EFF has lawyers, and we found that actually most of the time all they're doing is writing blog entries and talking to the press. But they're doing so in the context of the legal discussion of how the government ought to work, how it does work, what the courts are saying. I think this is tremendously important, tremendously good news, something to push your friends to join org. Just one person is actually just helpful. At EFF, for years, it was one head person who was the poster child for us on the press, and he was tremendously effective. Just knowing that someone respectful was there. And I actually wanted to, at this point, draw some parallels between how EFF works in the States and its government and how org works. So one of the major differences is that there are actually decent people, not so cynical, in the government in the UK. In the US, that's just not the case. The idea that a new law would be proposed and the lawmakers would contact civil society for their opinion it's just a joke in the US. You can't imagine that. I'll use one example. Aaron Schwartz, many of you know, committed suicide, activist, and there was this push to pass reform of the CFA, the law that was used to push him over the edge. And it went in with some really good reforms. The public said, oh, this is so bad. And then it was immediately turned into this nightmare draft that actually extended the laws that put Aaron over the edge and criminalized a number of things that were in question. So one of them in the CFA, it was just blocked last week, hopefully, that is kind of mind-boggling. The government in the States has always said that violating a terms of service agreement, right, those long things that iTunes makes you click through, is a federal crime. Say it's on the same level as murder. Okay? And this has been upheld. Actually, Facebook kept a website from crawling their website to pull out information so you could copy another one with the user's permission. And they said it was a federal crime, and the court agreed. So the new CFA actually said this, and one of the things that helped defeat it was 17 magazine, which is her publication, big magazine for average age 16-year-olds. On their website says, you must be 18 years or older to read this website, on 17 magazine. Under the CFA, it would thus be a crime, literally akin to murder, to visit 17 website if you're under 18. And so this whole notion that the government is your friend, or that there actually are decent people, or there's some people who aren't cynical bastards, that's gone from the US. And there are parts of that here. So for example, when a new law gets drafted in the US, who do you think writes it? Always, it's the lobbyists who already paid for that senator or congressman who actually draft the law, and then it shows up there, right? And when you look at the Digital Economy Act, I sort of wonder, is that what happened here? I don't actually know the process by which it was drafted, but it certainly looks like it was just written by lobbyists who just handed it and said, here you go. That's not always the case in the UK, but there's trends there. There are still decent people. And the power of org has been to be an honest broker, to be somebody who actually doesn't let those civil servants down by using propaganda or by stretching the truth, so that the facts are there and we're believable and we can provide them a position. Journalists also interested in that. There's a different concept of journalism in the UK, that your role is actually to educate people and to be fair, whereas the US concept of journalism is to present both sides of the story, typically extreme one side and extreme the other. Both sides kind of absurd. And the net effect is that org's approach has in many ways been appropriate and effective in the UK, and I don't want to see it be an EFF. So I'm not suggesting we hire a whole bunch of lawyers and start suing the government. That's not it. But, so EFF's history. Originally we were founded as a lobby group in the US, and it was because the government raided this card maker who had like a Dungeons and Dragons type game that was about hackers. And the government looked at the cards and said, this is a manual for hacking computer manuals, and seized all the computers, never pressed charges, just destroyed a company. Now, you know, they may have done this recently with Mega Upload as well, just take everything, destroy someone, don't actually bother with due process. And our origin is in lobbying. Now, the reason we pulled out of Washington is because we found that what was happening is we were being used to legitimize bad laws and make them slightly less awful. But because the law was so bad, and then we'd say, okay, over here, okay, we'll allow that one because that's the best we can do. And so we actually found that EFF's presence in Washington was helping pass bad laws. So we actually completely restructured, left Washington, and now we're in San Francisco. And our approach is purely, say purely, but mostly suing companies and suing the government when bad laws happen, or bad laws exist, or bad interpretations exist. One area that EFF is active in, I'd love to see EFF more active in, is technology projects. Most recently, we've been really concerned about privacy and snooping and sniffing, and we wanted to see more websites support HTTPS, just when you use it all the time. And one of the things that drove this was the continued Chinese attacks on Gmail and other sites getting into mail accounts. Facebook accounts of activists in the Arab countries being hacked, being used to bag a whole bunch of activists. And what we did is we developed a tool called HTTPS Everywhere, which is a plugin now for Firefox and Chrome, which has a large database of websites that support HTTPS and just automatically goes to it. So if you plug in HTTPS Everywhere, you go to Facebook, it'll rewrite it as HTTPS Facebook.com. Do the same thing for Gmail, many, many sites. And what's happened is it's incredibly popular, and it's been used to pressure companies now to support HTTPS. And that's one person working part-time to make that plugin. So it doesn't take much money, but it takes a certain kind of thinking. And it takes the kind of thinking that org can do. And think, how do we pressure this? Or how do we create a technology tool which causes this to happen? Some of our biggest successes, for example, we helped fund the Tor project, initially EFF did, which eventually spun off and is now tremendously important. We thought we needed a good way for people to be able to surf the internet unspied upon. So that would be one way that I think we could copy and approach there. But otherwise, I think that the EFF approach is very much a US one. And the org approach is one that works well here. And I've seen org have more and more to do with Europe and EDRI. And I think that's really powerful and important, and it's been effective. This was meant as a joke. Ruth put it up as a blog entry of here's the agenda for the year the government's proposing. But I found it actually tremendously helpful for what we're actually trying to achieve in the UK. And you probably can't read it all. There's the blog entry, and it's in the PDF as well. But what's interesting about this list is about half the stuff is actually happening. At least it's being discussed. There's possibilities of, when you've got repeals of the Digital Economy Act, well, it hasn't come into effect yet, and it might not. It might be stillborn. And there are other things in here that are in the course of happening. So it's not just a wish list, it's also an action list. It's actually what's being done. So if these sorts of things interest you, you care about them, join org, nag your friends, buy them a beer to make them join org, join the EFF. That's the easy way to do it. Just Google join the organization. There's my email address, and I'll just put it as a bottom. Didn't talk about myself. If you want to support independent music, visit magnitude.com. That's my day job. Thanks for having me. There's a second microphone. If there are any questions, if not, we can go to coffee, or I'm happy to entertain whatever you might want to say or ask. Oh, over here? No, you stretching?
Good stretch.
He's actually, oh, we can't actually talk at the same time, which is fine.
Hello?
Yes?
So this is, well, anyway, the question is, the EFF...
we can hear you just fine.
The EFF has, it would seem, quite a lot of corporate sponsors. Do you think that's an area that perhaps ought to develop on?
I'll turn it off and on. Does that work out?
Well, I've finished my question now. So.
Okay. Okay. This is a Spinal Tap moment. Okay, that's sort of working not really. Okay, same channel. So the question was, corporate sponsorship, is this something org should also go after? We've talked about this in the advisory board. I think very much org should not go after corporate money. And the reason is that cynicism doesn't exist in the UK among the civil servants that, oh, we shouldn't even talk to civil society, we should do whatever our masters or my political persuasion says. And I've seen time and again civil servants approach org because org is seen as actually representative of voters, as if that mattered. That kind of blew my mind. That matters here? I kind of like being here in a country that actually matters, representative of voters. And they actually said, I remember in one discussion, some civil servants said, we don't want to just do what the companies want us to do. I didn't sound like the government speaking, but apparently someone in the government felt that way. And sometimes they ask org to be quiet, you know, just confidentially talk to us, but not make it public because our boss would make us stop. But you're arming us with information weapons that are very useful. It's an interesting thing. So actually, if you you could probably Google EFF in bed with Google and come up with many people having that rant. The number of times we at EFF has sued Google. I mean, most recently over the Google book settlement. We basically ally with them when we agree and not otherwise. We've taken Microsoft money for a while until we sued or made a position that Microsoft didn't like, and now they don't give us money ever. The key is we don't take money with any strings, and we also don't take any stock. So companies have given us stock, and we have to sell it. Now, that's one of the advantages of it's one of the advantages of having lawyers on staff, but in fact, org could benefit from that, where they tell us where the ethics, legal ethics, are clear and not clear, and we can't have stock in a company that might be affected by a lawsuit. So I think that's a great strength, and actually it wasn't mentioned that, you know, if you join org, that's it. There are grants and there's individual subscribers, but there aren't companies sending money at the organization, and that's why the reputation is so good. Why don't we just use one microphone and make you run?
If you toggle that off.
All right.
Not the power, just
The bottom one. All right.
We're not on the.
All right.
Yeah, I can speak as well. Why do you not think legal action against the government, etc., is not useful in the UK? I mean, I'm a law student, and I'm seeing a lot of stuff that needs to be actioned in some respects over different areas, such as data protection. So why is that your view?
So I wouldn't say, no, double negative. A team of lawyers in org would be lovely. The biggest thing I would use the lawyers for initially would be to speak legalese, to write legal papers, to be part of the consultation process with lawyers who are writing laws, that sort of thing. So that would be initially quite useful. Secondly, I would use lawyers for key cases. So, for example, if it turns out that you can't use Wi-Fi in the UK without showing identification, it'd be great if that were challenged on, for example, I believe it's a human rights issue. And a lawsuit is the right forum for many things like that. I've also, I remember, what's his name? Tassos is his first name. He's a Greek lawyer here, I believe at Oxford. And he was suggesting actually suing under Brussels to try and reveal the secret treaties between collecting societies that they won't reveal. And the idea was not that the lawsuit should actually be successful, but rather that discovery would force all sorts of secret things to be revealed, which judges can compel, as well as lawyers compelling, for example, secret documents that ought not to be secret to be revealed, to various requests of the government. And then as far as suing the government directly, I actually can't comment on that because I don't know the UK government legal process well enough to comment on that, other than to say that the UK's, the US is leaning on precedent, and how important that is makes it much easier for us to challenge laws and break them down, whereas here Queen's Counsel has much more impact, and I don't think precedent is quite as important.
It is actually
Okay.
massively important.
Then, as I said, I'm not qualified to answer that question.
Quite similar.
Okay.
Function with function as system of common law precedent as well.
Which is why I said I shouldn't have opened my gob, because I'm not qualified to comment on how effectively. Yeah. So that would be lovely. It's the other problem with lawyers is you're all too expensive. Yes. Actually, at EFF, we work an awful lot with, at Harvard, there's, I'm forgetting what the center is called.
Buckman?
Yes, the Buckman Center, thank you. And in Berkeley, there's another legal clinic, and often there's a lot of hard work to be done and to challenge. It's a lot of fun, actually, when you're a law student, to challenge something at a very high governmental level. And you can get a lot of press for it. So, but generally you need a lawyer or two inside EFF or inside org to coordinate it. So yes, but I don't think the funding is there yet. I don't know how many people we have inside org now.
It's 3 full-time and 4 part-time.
Right. And then how about the unemployed slaves? The unpaid slaves?
There's a few people who are interns as well.
Okay, interns. So maybe 10 total, but I mean, I think lawyers start at £80,000 a year, So if the funding were there, and maybe the grants would be there. One of the things I'll mention as well, EFF, which is interesting, is year after year, since I've joined, we've looked at about 20% annual growth in giving, and we've been staffing up. And that's because we've hit, I believe, some sort of tipping point in competency and visibility where grants are easier to obtain, where organizations that want to be active in a field look to see who does it well, and then ask those organizations to request funding. And I think org is not there yet, but if we continue working as well as we have been, and be very, very careful about our reputation, then that will happen, and that would be very exciting. Okay, you guys can hear me okay then, yeah?
Yeah, it's the audio recording.
Oh, for the audio recording.
There's been a shift in the UK over recent years towards a more American cultural way of thinking. So I was wondering, do you think that the UK is heading towards a more cynical law system? I mean, recently we've seen things like you can't protest outside Parliament, and protests in London can only take place for an hour before they have to then be disbanded. And we've had problems with actual police regulation and turning peaceful protests into riots. So whilst it's nice to think the UK is better than America at the moment, do you think it's turning that way? And if so, is there a way to prevent it?
It is absolutely turning that way. I remember when I first moved to the UK, there was some ruling about how you couldn't have any weapon within a mile of Parliament or something like that. And I remember a journalist was asked by a constable, "Oh, do you have a knife or anything?" He's, "Oh, I have a penknife." "Oh, just use it to demonstrate." And then they arrested the poor sap because he had a little Swiss Army penknife and overnight in prison because he was near Parliament with a penknife. And he was a member of the press, and he volunteered it to a constable. And there he was in prison. That's that sort of kind of mindless, psychotic police behavior that, one hopes won't happen here. Thankfully, most policemen don't carry weapons still. So we don't have this arming sort of fight fire with fire escalation that you have in the States, where the solution to some kid killing 20 other kids is to arm all the kids and all the teachers. Thankfully, that hasn't gone that way, but we also, in the UK, don't have extremely expensive elections in the same way. And that's probably the single worst thing that's happened in the US that's led to everything falling apart. And you can't back out of it once you start going down that path. So that's a good thing. However, I would say the copyright industry has been more and more listened to. The Digital Economy Act, you kind of go, why is this needed? Well, do something. It won't work. Doesn't matter. And certainly the war on terror for a while really was bad. But then again, it really killed Tony Blair's career and reputation. And so a lot of politicians have backed off of that as a bad idea. Did I not have this slide? Oh, you know, I didn't. I have to show you this cartoon. It's Obama dancing with a certain somebody. Here we go. Come on. Is that going to show up? There. You can see if I can make it work. Yes, that's just great. There we go. Those aren't the original taglines. I modified them. You know, actually, Obama was a copyright lawyer. That was his previous career. You know, the feeling is the UK is, oh, we have a special relationship with the US, you know, which often means, you know, we're a bitch. That's been unfortunate, and occasionally the UK has a spine, but often not. So I don't know to what extent it's driven internally by UK, what's happening there, versus just trying to appease the US and play nice. But it is terrifying to behold.
Yeah, there's too much abuse of the US going on internationally. I mean, look at keynote and the fact that his rights are completely violated with the entire search of his house.
I mean, the .com thing actually is fantastic, the mega upload, the way that's played out, because you know, I'm sure many of you know, there's this great, Google it, there's this great British video about, I think it's the BPI, scary 1984 police helmeted breaking down some kid because he's downloading something on BitTorrent. And we all looked at that video and said, oh, what a great piece of propaganda. And then the actual footage of the mega upload raid came in with the helicopters and, you know, the guys and guns. And it was pretty much the same thing, but the response by the government in Australia was so different now. Was just, okay, the police actually knew they shouldn't have been spying on this guy. And they did anyway, and so major officials are, you know, leaving office, and the court case is moving forward, and the government has apologized personally to him. And I mean, this is unimaginable in the U.S. and probably pretty unimaginable here too. I mean, can you imagine if the court trial with Assange, for example, went that, oh, we shouldn't have done this? Could you imagine the UK government apologizing, oh, we've mistreated you? Sorry. No, you can't imagine that. It was the war on terror. Anything goes. Sorry.
No, with this, it was New Zealand being violated.
Sorry, New Zealand, not Australia.
Warrant laws.
Yes.
Because their warrant laws state that you have to be searching for something specific.
Right. Well, there are multiple. Yeah. My understanding is there's multiple violations.
US as well,
Right.
which
So.
you're not legally allowed to export
Yeah.
information
So.
research, but the FBI just exported it anyway. But it's that way that America seems to just be trampling international law and ignoring it.
Well, I don't know if it was the U.S. was in trampling it, or as much as New Zealand was very, very happy to trample their own laws to make the U.S. happy. I mean, there's a whole bunch of, they didn't have the correct warrant. They were spying on him when they didn't have the permission to spy. Those are the two I know of, but there's probably others. They've seized everything. They've destroyed the company without blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of business as usual. But the bigger issue is governments doing whatever the U.S. tells them to do. But then if it really blows up in their face, which it has twice now, right? ACTA, total freaking disaster for the U.S. SOPA is not going to go to the EU Parliament floor. I mean, when you have protests in the streets, that's bad over something really geeky. And this is better. So, well, it's not nice to these people to go through this, and certainly wasn't nice to have ACTA. It's, you know, the best thing that can happen for democracy is for the foes of democracy to overreach their hand, overplay their hand. And then suddenly people are motivated. If we just lose a little bit, you know, like I can't access a website on my mobile phone, that's one thing. But when we've gone to war against someone we didn't want to go to war with, that's a different thing. So, and the US doesn't seem to get moderation. All right, I'm being told to end. So catch me around the halls. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was excellent. Excellent overview of all of the issues, which we'll now break up and discuss in more detail. So the two panels, thank you. So the two panels that we